Hey, how's it going, everybody? I am Indypride from Milk and Cookies Total War, joined by Loremaster of Sotek, and we are here to discuss the future of the Total War Warhammer Trilogy, specifically Game 2 of the series, how it will be implemented, and what factions we can expect going forward. Some of this video will be based on information explicitly stated and released by CA themselves, some of it based on interviews and articles they've done with major gaming outlets recently, and a lot of it will be speculation based on our knowledge of Total War Warhammer and Warhammer Fantasy in general. So before we get too far into the video, I need to bring everybody up to speed because even though some of you follow Total War Warhammer news regularly, there is a significant portion of the community that is very casual, very laid back, and not super invested in this series other than watching the occasional YouTube video. And so for those people, a lot of the news on Reddit and Total War forums just doesn't reach them. So Total War Warhammer is going to be a trilogy of games that will incorporate every major Warhammer race into a playable map and campaign. Here is the exact quote from Creative Assembly. The next two Warhammer games will be standalone releases with their own campaign maps, and each will have a quartet of starting factions exactly like the first game, in the words of brand director Rob Bartholomew. He also told us that future maps will be as big or bigger than that of the first game, and that the sequels will also be supported by DLC and free DLC, presumably supplied by the new content team. The most exciting feature of the forthcoming sequels is that, as well as being standalone games, they will also bolt on to the first, expanding its map and the faction rosters within the game. So if you own all three games, you'll be able to play a grand campaign straddling three theaters of war in the Warhammer world. Now, how exactly those three theaters will be incorporated into a single game is still up in the air. We don't know. There are a few ways Creative Assembly could do it. The first is a system similar to Empire Total War, where it had a map of the Americas, it had a map of Europe, and a map of India that you basically cycle through by clicking left and right arrows. So that's one cool way they could do it. Or the other way would be how Call of Warhammer Beginning of the End Times does it, where there's one gigantic campaign map with all the important areas of the Warhammer world, and you basically just scroll. So the reason we're talking about this specifically right now is there were a couple articles released yesterday that dropped on PC Gamer and Rock Paper Shotgun that had some interesting news, and there's a lot of stuff to discuss there. So Sotek, do you want to summarize those articles real quick? Give me your thoughts on what you think they mean for the trilogy, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So the main purpose of the two articles is that both of them are saying that with the release of Bretonnia, which of course just came out a few days ago, that Total War Warhammer for the most part is done with major DLC. So what we're seeing here is that Game 2 has also been in production for quite some time, as has been known by most of the community, and it's likely that we're starting to reach that point where they're either going to release the announcement for Game 2, which is the main reason why we're doing this video, as well as wrapping up a few final components of Game 1. Both of the articles, of course, will be posted in probably both of our description boxes, so you can read them for yourself. But the general consensus is that Game 1 is nearing its end, so it's time to start getting the hype and preparation and everything for Game 2, which will likely be announced sooner rather than later. However, before we look too far to the future, it's important to look on what we've gotten up to this point with. One of the important things to understand about Creative Assembly's approach to Total War Warhammer is something that's known as the community as the 10-year plan, which is that when Creative Assembly basically announced Total War Warhammer, they came out with this idea that they basically want to have the trilogy stretched over 10 years. This has caused some confusion because some people seem to think that it indicates that from the day they released Game 1, they wanted to go for 10 years. In my personal opinion, I think they meant from when they started development, which could have been anywhere from 2014, maybe 2015, maybe earlier. This game was in development for a long time because Game 1 probably is going to require the most work from the ground up. I don't think we're going to see massive gaps and an actual 10-year gap between the three games, because that would get kind of ridiculous. But that being said, I think we're far along in the 10-year plan, if not halfway there, then maybe almost halfway there while we approach the announcement of Game 2. But there's a lot of really important reasons why that's probably the case, and why CA probably is ready to hit the iron very, very soon again while they have the impetus on their side. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Indypride to talk more in depth about why it's crucial that CA is making a very strategic and quick choice rather than sitting on their heels and letting things cool off.
Yeah, I mean, there's no like real hard analysis here. I just think it's kind of logical for the trilogy to be well on its way in terms of the 10-year plan. It's just really important for Creative Assembly to strike while the iron is hot with a trilogy like this. You want people to be excited about Game 2 and Game 3, and the longer you wait in between those releases, the bigger an issue it's going to be for the community. The more people, more fans you're going to be losing along that time frame because they're going to move on to bigger and better things. And it's not just that. If Game 3, for example, came out 6 years after Game 1, by that point technology and graphical fidelity, which as we know evolves very rapidly in this sphere, basically, Game 3 just isn't going to look good anymore for that time period. Think about how good games are going to look 6 years from now. There's going to be a huge increase in graphical fidelity and technology. So if they're releasing Game 3, which is going to be on a similar or the same engine you would expect for a trilogy of games, it's just going to be weird if they wait so long in between. So I'm personally thinking that we're going to be seeing Game 2 by quarter 4 of 2017 or quarter 1 of 2018. Sotek, I actually think it's going to be even earlier than that. When did you say you think it's going to be coming out by?
My prediction is for late summer or early fall.
Yeah, so we don't know this, obviously, but again, the longer CA waits, the more fans they're going to lose. Not because they think the game's bad, but because hype behind the game is just going to die down and people will be moving on to other things. So we'll see how it goes, but I think a lot of people think that there's going to be these big gaps in between the games. I really don't think that's going to be the case. So moving on, it's also important to note that CA has explicitly said that Game 1 and the subsequent DLC, so Beastmen and Wood Elves and all those other DLC packs, that they said that it sold so well that their plans for the trilogy have expanded dramatically. What does that mean? Well, we don't know yet what they mean by expanding dramatically. From the beginning, CA has stated that their goal is to release all 16 major Warhammer races as playable factions, which essentially means the 15 main army book factions and Forge World Chaos Dwarfs as the 16th. So far, I'm not sure if we've seen evidence of those plans expanding in Game 1 other than the addition of sub-factions due to community desire and the Wood Elves being a much more fleshed out DLC when you compare them to the Beastmen. So at this point, while I'm obviously extremely excited to be able to play all major Warhammer races in the trilogy, all combined into one campaign and multiplayer experience, at this point that's on the low end of my expectations for the trilogy, because all of that from the beginning has already been promised. When I hear plans for the trilogy have massively expanded, I'm thinking about seeing fully fleshed out minor factions like Kislev, like Dogs of War, like the Strigoi and Necrarch bloodlines for the vampire counts, like a robust Avatar Conquest multiplayer experience with an army painter, that kind of stuff. There's a whole host of implementation CA could make when they're talking about expanding the game, and I don't think that seeing Demons of Chaos is the kind of expansion they were talking about, because they were promised effectively from the beginning. So, Sotek, what do you think are some things we could see in the Warhammer Trilogy going forward that would fit CA's description of a massively expanded trilogy?
Sure. I think the first thing that comes to my personal mind is seeing complete rosters. One thing that I think a lot of people have appreciated about the Wood Elves and Bretonnia in particular is that compared to most of the other factions, we got them at release with every single toy that they typically have in their tabletop and lore fashions. Even quite a few new units in the case of Bretonnia, and even Wood Elves with having dragons without riders. So that's something I personally consider to be part of it, rather than seeing factions like the Warriors of Chaos, who came out at release. And I think a lot of people would say that the Warriors have probably the weakest roster in the game, because they came out with sort of this idea where they encapsulated the heart of the race, I guess, but it's missing a lot of the really fun things that really add the flavor and make it more than just a bunch of people wearing armor marching across a field. So one thing, that's probably the biggest thing that comes to mind, is seeing those finished rosters, which could of course be through free LC or DLC. The second thing that comes to my mind is if they're looking to expand their ideas, one of the things I hope is that means that they're really aiming to innovate and develop a true uniqueness to each faction. I'm someone who tends to think that less is more if it's more developed, quality over quantity, so to speak, in that I would be less excited necessarily to see more factions like the Kislevites and the Dogs of War, rather than more excited to see if maybe some of the factions such as Midland were developed but were truly an iconic faction rather than just being a reskin of the Empire. I do agree that we need an army painter, though. That is a desperate need this game should have and needs to get on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's Warhammer. Like, Warhammer without an army painter is not truly Warhammer. And of course, CA has done an incredible job thus far of fleshing out this incredible fantasy universe. But yeah, I mean, army painter, like we had an army painter in Shogun 2. It's not necessarily an easy implementation, but it's a necessary one for Warhammer games. If you look at the majority of games like this, and there are very few that are fleshed out to the detail that CA's done with Total War Warhammer, but yeah, it would just be so amazing, either in campaign or if it was only for custom battle and multiplayer, to be able to go in and paint your stuff. It's just a huge part of the personalization of Warhammer Fantasy and a big draw for it. If I want to put pink armor on my Black Orcs in multiplayer, I should absolutely be able to, and that's what I'm hoping for when they're talking about expanding options and expanding the ideas they have for the game. That's one thing that we didn't necessarily have to assume would be there on release, but would definitely be outside the lines and one of those things they could expand to going forward. So we'll see. Avatar Conquest, again, I've made videos about it. I might even make another one. The last one I did was I think in 2015. But Avatar Conquest, a huge deal for me as a multiplayer focused guy. Would be incredible to see it make its way over to Warhammer Fantasy with all these very unique races. So yeah, we'll see how they decide to do it. Obviously, Warriors of Chaos dramatically missing a bunch of their stuff that they really need to have. We'll be seeing more chaos going forward in this trilogy, of course. Demons of Chaos and the marks for the Warriors of Chaos, so god-specific units like the Hellflayers of Slaanesh, Hellstriders, those kind of things, Khorne, Juggernauts, those kind of units. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that CA is going to be making going forward. We'll see how they decide to do it. Now, there was an article written on a Polish website a few months ago that went under the radar. A lot of people missed it, and it was translated by a bunch of different Polish speakers. So maybe not perfect translations, but by native Polish speakers, so I can assume that the way they translated these articles was correct. But it was weird because there weren't any other major English-speaking news outlets that covered the same content. So I do have to take it with a grain of salt, but they did have an exclusive interview with Creative Assembly. And so the gist of the article was the reporters explicitly saw CA employees. They went to Horsham, went to CA headquarters, and saw CA employees working on a Dark Elf Hydra model. Now, to be completely fair, months before release, we saw a similar thing. We saw CA employees working on a huge variety of models on a computer, basically just a computer with 15 or 20 models for the trilogy, and they had basic skeletons and musculature already built for the creatures that weren't in the game yet. So I think there were some phoenixes. There might have been a greater demon of chaos or two. I can't remember exactly what monsters were included in that picture that we saw, but there were a lot of them. Again, I think there was a phoenix there as well, which obviously isn't in the game yet. But basically, they were early designs that were nowhere near completion, but they were being worked on. So that in and of itself, seeing a CA employee working on a Dark Elf Hydra doesn't mean explicitly that Game 2 is going to have Dark Elves, but the line of logic I'm following here is that if they're fleshing out a model like the Dark Elf Hydra, as in they're adding the texture work, they're adding the animations, that is the best piece of evidence so far that Game 2 is going to be High Elves, Dark Elves, Lizardmen, and a fourth as yet unknown faction. Basically, a new world expansion for Total War Warhammer. And this does match up perfectly with what we saw in the Russian data mining leak, which was that the Dark Elves, the High Elves, and the Lizardmen would be in Game 2. So the alternative, of course, would be to be expanding into Nehekara, where the Tomb Kings are, expanding east to the Mountains of Morn, and the Darklands, where the Chaos Dwarfs and the Ogre Kingdoms are. But I think that Game 2, we're going to be seeing High Elves, Lizardmen, and Dark Elves. So going off of that line of logic, Sotek, what do you think about all that? Do you think that that's a logical line of logic to follow? And where can we go from there if CA is actually going to expand Game 2 into the New World?
Yeah, I definitely agree with quite a bit of that, and there's been some pretty heavy indications in my own circles of the internet that Game 2 will be featuring the Lizardmen Dark Elf High Elf release. During my time on Lustria Online, which is a wonderful community for Lizardmen players for tabletop and other various mediums, we actually had an encounter with CA almost a year ago now, if not a little more than that, where they were looking for custom Kroxigor models, which of course are the Lizardmen heavy hitters. Monstrous Infantry. So there does seem to be some support that they've been working on the models for Game 2 at least for a year, if not longer now. So that seems to be a strong indication there. As to the other subjects, I definitely agree that the Game 2 is either going to be the New World or the expanded part of what some people could consider technically the Old World. Of course, the Old World in its entirety is featured in Game 1, but there are some rather expanded elements with, of course, the coast of Araby, which we have currently, expands into Nehekara, or the Land of the Dead, where the Tomb Kings reside. And if you go just east past the World's Edge Mountains, where the map currently ends, you enter the Darklands, where the nefarious Chaos Dwarves are, and to the far eastern side of their land are the Mountains of Morn, where the Ogre Kingdoms preside. Personally, I'm thinking Lustria is the stronger contender right now, which will take us across the ocean, where you'll find Ulthuan, which is more of a Atlantis-themed island, that sits between the equivalent of North America and Europe, and then of course the North America equivalent, which is cold and chill Nagaroth, where the Dark Elves preside, and south of them is the South America equivalent, which is Lustria, which is dominated by the Lizardmen, but has quite a nasty infestation of Skaven, to say the least.
So before we jump into that, before we start talking about the factions we might see in Game 2 and specifically what kind of content we can expect from them, I want to finish up on this Polish article discussion. So besides mentioning the Dark Elf Hydra in that article, the real bombshell they dropped was, and again, this might have been a translation error, but they were talking about the Man of War license and the fact that CA actually doesn't have any rights to it. Now, for those who don't know, Dreadfleet and Man of War were the naval equivalent of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and what the article seemed to be implying, if not outright stating, was that without the license to Man of War, CA might skip naval battles entirely and handle it like they're currently doing it in Total War Warhammer for Game 1, as in, you can't fight naval battles on the ocean, which might be very disappointing to some people. I'll be honest, as much as I like the idea of naval warfare and the fact that it could be incredibly interesting and diverse and fun in a Warhammer fantasy setting, naval battles are not personally why I play Total War. They never have been. They never will be. I would not be heartbroken if naval combat didn't make it in. I know some people would because they played Napoleon, they played Empire, and absolutely loved the naval combat in that. And I 100% admit, in Warhammer Fantasy, seeing a dwarf fleet would be incredibly epic and a lot of fun if done correctly. But there are things I'd prefer CA to focus on, like completely fleshing out the land rosters for each major faction. But if they can add naval combat in without hurting all that other content, I'll be all for it. So, Sotek, what do you think about naval combat? Do you think it's going to be necessary in Total War Warhammer, or do you think the auto-resolve is going to be perfectly fine and just keep it as a means of transporting troops across the oceans? And specifically, I want you to talk about what role does it play in the Warhammer world for the High Elves and the Dark Elves especially, which are both very much seafaring nations.
Sure. So to start off, I'm one of the people that, although I do not require naval combat in my life, it would be a very welcome addition to the franchise. However, when it comes to Game 2 in particular, there does enter sort of a weird bump of that we do have these large swaths of ocean, which means one of two things is going to need to happen before we get too into the Dark Elves and High Elves in particular. And the first one of these two things is that either we need to be able to travel across the ocean much faster than we currently can, or at least there needs to be some channel by which you can move quickly. That way you can get from Lustria to the Old World and vice versa in a relatively swift amount of time, or naval combat needs to come into the game, so making those journeys is actually a worthwhile experience and not just you wasting your army away through maybe high seas attrition or trying to take seapost settlements over the course of 5 or 6 turns. That being said, there is a very large missed opportunity if they do not expand on naval warfare with the High Elves and the Dark Elves. What many people may not necessarily know is that the High Elves and the Dark Elves are the primary protagonists and antagonists of ocean warfare in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. The High Elves consider themselves the guardians of the world, and the way that they choose to influence the world is through their absolutely massive fleets. The High Elves have ships the likes of which can take down entire nations, especially their legendary dragon ships. Which, as you may guess, can actually store a dragon or two on board. The High Elves actually are one of the only races that have a notable amount of outposts all around the world that basically create a giant net across the entire planet, and these fortresses are all named after various parts of the day. So you have the Fortress of Dawn, you have the Fortress of Dusk, and so on and so forth. One of these is stationed, of course, on the very southern tip of Lustria. One of them is stationed near the Dragon Isles to the east of the Old World, and they're kind of all over the place. And the reason they have these is the High Elves view it as their duty to protect the world of order from destruction. So they use these ways to attack roving Chaos fleets, the Norskins, of course, Skaven fleets when those pop up, Orc fleets, and, of course, the nefarious Dark Elves. The Dark Elves in particular are actually not a very self-sustaining race. Nagaroth is a very cold, nasty, nasty place. It's basically Canada if you made it about 50 degrees colder all the time. And because of this, it's basically turned into a winter horrorscape that's about as cruel and unwieldy as the Dark Elves are themselves. So what they rely on for their main source of income and life is to raid other nations. This is why most of their great citadels and cities are made of things called black arcs, which are literally giant fortresses that have been enchanted so that they float across the ocean. Many of them are pulled by giant sea monsters or just moved by magic itself, and they are basically the equivalent of the city of Altdorf or Talabheim or Cologne or any of the other major cities, but on the ocean and mobile and equipped with war machines and carried by giant monsters. And it would be a real shame not to have these very iconic figures, especially when it comes to wars between the Dark Elves and the High Elves in particular. Many of their great battles were fought at sea, especially between Sea Lord Islin of the High Elves and, of course, Lokir Felhart of the Dark Elves. Although I don't think at the end of the day it's absolutely necessary to have these things, because as you say, Warhammer Fantasy is primarily based on land battles, it would be a truly missed privilege to be able to experience those epic naval combats, especially to see some, of course, the other famous fleets. Bretonnia and the Empire have massive fleets. The Orcs have hilarious ramshackle fleets that are quite infamous. And, of course, playing Warriors of Chaos without being able to take to the seas and raid the coasts of those you hate and despise is kind of missing out a little bit. So those would have to probably be my concise thoughts on that particular subject.
Okay, yeah, I feel like they could definitely do naval warfare, but considering the amount of work they'd have to put into it, I do think they should get every single major Warhammer race out and in the game first with fleshed out rosters before we move on to naval combat. I think for now, for Game 2, that naval movement is important, right? You're going to have to be able to sail from Ulthuan to Nagaroth, vice versa. If you're the Dark Elves, a huge part of their lore is raiding the Northern Empire and the west coast of Bretonnia. They do that all the time, so they do go out on these raider attacks and raid the coast. But in terms of movement, that's really the most important thing, being able to cross the ocean and get to the other side, which is already in the game. For the Black Arcs, we could still see models like that. In fact, I can guarantee you with the Dark Elves being introduced, there will be maps in Total War Warhammer 2 that will be Dark Elf, Black Arc, Corsair maps. But that's more of a land battle fight, right? The Black Arc Corsair, or the Black Arcs are so large that it's not really a ship. Like, if you look at it from a Total War Warhammer battle map perspective, it's just going to look more like a city. So you might see on the edges that it's out, there's water out in the distance, but it's not going to be like a Total War naval battle where you have multiple ships fighting, because if you have two Black Arcs fighting each other, that's way too big, right? Like, you just can't fit that on a single map. So, yeah, I think that naval battles should be in the game at some point if CA can afford it, and if they can do it, but there are more important things to be added beforehand, at least in my opinion. But there are going to be lots of people who think that naval combat should definitely be in Game 2 and are very much missing it, and I understand where they're coming from on that front. But kind of moving on here, I think there needs to be a link between Game 1 and Game 2. That's a piece of content that encourages Game 2 owners to also buy Game 1. So for example, if you own Game 1 and Game 2, they're going to link together. You could also, because they're standalone games, only buy Game 2, at least if we're going by what Creative Assembly has told us thus far. So we already think that Lizardmen, High Elves, and the Dark Elves are going to be 3 major players, but CAA said that there are going to be 4 major races in each game, and also have a pre-order bonus. So we don't know what the pre-order bonus is yet. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but I think that's why the fourth race, the Skaven make a ton of sense. And there's a couple reasons for that. They're back in Lustria, but they hold a ton of power in the old world, which is where the game is set now. That seat of power they have is Skaven Blight near Talea and Estalia, and they also have a couple other seats of power like Hell Pit for Clan Molder, which is near Norska and that border of Kislev, I believe. And they have Queek Headtaker and Clan Morse that are currently residing in Karak 8 Peaks in that 3-way war. In terms of a Total War Warhammer implementation of Clan Morse, I think they could actually start in Karak 8 Peaks, because we only have rebels in there now, and in the lore they're a very big player for that. And if they had Queek Headtaker starting in Karak 8 Peaks, that suddenly allows Belegar and allows Skarsnik to still do their invasion of Karak 8 Peaks and begin that 3-way war, and they don't have to create like another DLC or something weird where you have that 3-way war completely fleshed out. We'll see how they do it, but I think that makes a lot of sense to have Queek Headtaker start in Karak 8 Peaks, but then we would have Clan Pestilence, Lord Skrolk, in Lustria being a huge threat to the Lizardmen, so that would be the stopgap between the 2 games. You're having a race that has a big, important part to play in the old world, the Skaven Under Empire below the Human Empire, below Talea and Estalia, and being a massive threat there, but you also have them being a massive threat to the Lizardmen in Lustria. Now, there is no other race in Total War Warhammer Fantasy besides maybe the Vampire Counts that have a better opportunity for sub-factions than the Skaven. I think the Skaven have like 6 or 7 probably sub-factions that would be all very logical to add in Total War Warhammer Game 2. So I think that they're very likely to be a headlining race. It is possible they become DLC, but I think, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that there are specific Lord packs that make a lot of sense to flesh out the Skaven and give them those sub-factions, but I think we will be starting with them as one of the 4 major playable races.
Real quick, I do want to go back and address my own thoughts on Queek, because I do think that he is definitely a strong contender for the little reward you receive for having both games. Though personally, I think he's actually going to start off in the capital Skaven city of Skaven Blight. My reason for being so is, although I think the Skaven are going to have a main focus in Lustria as part of Game 2, Skaven Blight will almost certainly be featured, as right now it's a zone you cannot enter, and it's the only remaining one to my knowledge in Game 1. And it's almost certainly going to activate when the Skaven come around, because of course it's their capital city and a very iconic and famous place of the Skaven. But on top of that, Queek, which many people should or may not know, but probably should, is that he is the third of the little triumvirate that fights over Karak 8 Peaks, being Skarsnik, King Belegar Ironhammer, and Queek Headtaker, who is a warlord of Clan Moors. So I think it might make sense, based on how they decided to do Skarsnik and Belegar, with the both of them starting very close to each other, so you can have that rivalry going real early. It would make sense to put Queek in Skaven Blight, because he would be right there. He would be just he'd be pretty close to where Belegar and Skarsnik both are, and would have a very solid access point to run up and jump into that melee, so you could have a 3-way fight between them, and all 3 of them, of course, scrambling to the east to try and be the first to claim Karak 8 Peaks and build whatever unique building they might have there. So it might add another level of tension to that really fun rivalry, and would likely make Queek have a very interesting campaign compared to his Skaven brethren over in Lustria. Yeah. That being said, from there, we can probably go ahead and talk about the actual pre-order bonus, because I think both of us agree that Queek wouldn't really make sense as a pre-order bonus, because pre-order has to work for if you just own Game 2. My personal thoughts on it is that Chaos is going to be present in all 3 games, most likely. Nagaroth, just like the Empire, or Kislev, technically, touches the realm of Chaos, or at least a realm that goes into it, in this case the Shadowlands. And Norskins and Warriors of Chaos very regularly launch invasions down into the realms of the Dark Elves. So it could make sense for Chaos to once again be the pre-order bonus, but this time maybe featuring a new legendary lord like Vashnar the Tormentor, who very infamously invaded Lustria not only a few years before the end times began, and maybe he would reveal some new units. So maybe we would see some of the very notable missing creatures and units from the Chaos roster, like the Chimera and other things like that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Indy?
I think there's almost no chance they're going to do the same thing with Chaos, considering the backlash the first time around. I'd be super surprised to see them do Chaos as a pre-order DLC, because the problem with doing Chaos as a pre-order DLC, even if it's fleshing out old content, is that if you don't pre-order, again, you're going to be missing out on all that content for Chaos, and they are the roster, as we already discussed, right now in Total War Warhammer that is lacking the most. They're lacking their Marks of Chaos, they're lacking their God-specific units. Demons of Chaos are not a part of the Warriors of Chaos roster unless CA does what I really want them to do, which is combine the Warriors of Chaos and Demons of Chaos roster into God-aligned factions, so you get your Skullcrushers of Khorne, you get your Bloodletters in the exact same roster, so a Warriors of Chaos unit and Demons of Chaos unit, but only Khorne faction, and an all Sinesh faction, and an all Nurgle faction, and an all Tzeentch faction. No idea if CA is going to do that. It's not how the army books are set up, so it might not even be possible for them to do it that way, because in 8th edition, as you should know by now, they are split into Demons of Chaos and Warriors of Chaos rosters, but I personally think that the God-aligned rosters are much more interesting. I doubt they're going to do another Chaos pre-order faction, given how much the backlash was, but I do want to talk about that backlash, so let's get all this out of the way first. It's weird, because it's already confirmed we're getting a pre-order bonus for Game 2. That much is confirmed by Creative Assembly. What that is yet, we obviously don't know, that's why we're discussing it. I personally think it's going to be a unique sub-faction for an already playable race, just so that CA doesn't have to deal with that Warriors of Chaos backlash again. The fact that it could be something like, and this is going to be an example, I don't think it's going to be Mousillon in this instance for the pre-order bonus, but a playable sub-faction that gives you a really unique start position for an already playable race is something that I would consider perfectly reasonable for a pre-order bonus. You don't need it. You don't need it to have the content and to enjoy the race, but it gives you a nice amount of replayability and rewards you for giving faith to Creative Assembly. But by the same token, they have generated a lot of goodwill since that whole Warriors of Chaos debacle, and logically speaking, it makes a lot less sense this time around to be enraged by a pre-order bonus. That's not to say, and I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of people hate pre-order bonuses, period, and I definitely understand where you're coming from on that front, but at least for me, a big part of the rage that came alongside that pre-order content and the content claims and all that was that we didn't know what we were going to be getting with Total War Warhammer. We didn't know that it was going to be running fantastic and that the game would be really well made. And obviously not everybody agrees with that, but I think the majority of the community can agree that Total War Warhammer has been a very good thing for the Total War series, and at least partially, if not fully, renewed your faith in Creative Assembly. If you love the first game and it runs well on your computer, and you already know what to expect, and CA has been very upfront about what we're going to be expecting in Game 1, and moving forward, I assume they're going to do the exact same thing for Game 2, there should be less furor over a pre-order DLC for Game 2, because you know what you're going to be getting, you know that Game 1 runs well, you know that it was a well-designed, well-made game. People were rightly afraid to pre-order the first game, because they were possibly expecting another Rome 2 debacle, or the kind of crappy optimization from Total War Attila, which is not what most people got. We got a much better, more polished game on release. It had a pretty smooth launch for most of the player base. So CA could decide to go that way again, giving more robust content, something like a Warriors of Chaos pre-order DLC. But if they're going to do it again, and it's risky. It's super risky. I don't know if they will. They probably won't. They need to make sure that it's a very well fleshed out faction. Because if it's not, then we're going to have the exact same thing we happened with Warriors of Chaos if they continue to stick with their no DLC for DLC policy, as in Warriors of Chaos won't be getting additional DLC. They might get stuff in the expansions, but that's a whole nother discussion that we're not going to touch on right now, but CA has said they're not going to be or at least they used to say, they're not going to be doing DLC for already released DLC factions. So something like the Beastmen aren't going to be getting their Gorgon and Jabber Scythe unless they add free content or expansion content later on down the line. It's a weird line. I don't know how CA is going to handle it, but I don't want, that's the biggest thing, I don't want another Warriors of Chaos scenario where an entire faction is going to get screwed for months or years at a time because they're not getting additional content. But with all that said, let's now move on to the major factions for Game 2. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on each one, but we're going to give a little bit of lore background and discuss the legendary lords we should expect and the starting positions for each of the 4 main races we expect to see in Game 2, being the Lizardmen, the Skaven, the High Elves, and the Dark Elves. So, Sotek, you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. So, beginning with the Lizardmen, there's a couple ways they could do it, but the way that I think is most likely is with the 2 legendary lords that we'll see for each faction. They could very well have different starting positions. So the first 2 that come to my mind, of course, are Lord Mazdamundi and Krokgar, who I'll go into a little bit more detail. Lord Mazdamundi, for those of you who don't know, is the Lord of the Solar City and would likely be the main Lizardman faction ruling from his city of Hexenal, which is in the north of Lestria. Lord Mazdamundi is the oldest living character in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. He predates Nagash, he predates even the demons of chaos themselves, and even the elves, the dwarves, and men. Lord Mazdamundi is also the most powerful living caster in the Warhammer world, who has feats the likes of which are not even close to being matched by other unique casters. There's an entire mountain range just north of his city called the Grey Guardians that he literally raised because he didn't want to deal with the Dark Elf invasion, so the Dark Elf army, which was massive, ended up just getting lost because a new mountain range sprung up around them and they all just died in the jungles. Mazdamundi, of course, is a Slan, which are large frog-like creatures, and he rides a massive Stegodon, or Triceratops, named Zlak, so it would be very fun to see him out there fighting among the Lizardmen. Of course, the other lord is Krokgar, known as the Ancient Scar Leader, who's the head of the Lizardmen armies. He is basically a Tyrannosaurus Rex that's about 12 feet tall and has a gauntlet that fires large beams of light that can incinerate people, including demons and undead in particular. And he rides on a much larger T-Rex named Grimlock, who can tear the throats out of dragons with relative ease. I would not be surprised to see him reigning from a different city, maybe Tlanxla in the east, or he could even come from his home city of Zodol if he wished. Then again, he could come from Itza, which is the first city that was ever built, and of course is the main fulcrum of the Lizardmen's power, and would give you a slightly different starting position that might be better to go take out the Skaven. Other than that, the rest would probably be relegated to DLC, but I'm curious to hear what Indypride's thoughts, of course, are on that.
Yeah, a couple of notes about that. So when Sotek was talking about how he would be shooting light from his Hand of the Gods, that would basically translate in Total War Warhammer to Shem's Burning Gaze, I believe, in Tabletop. It gives him a Lore of Light magic missile, so that'd be kind of cool to have a melee caster with a bound spell. Pretty powerful magic missile to be able to shoot from far away. And I do have a quick question. If this was a question I was talking about in my Lizardmen Lore Tactics Army video a couple days ago, I broached this topic, but I didn't know the answer. Lord Mazdamundi and End Times Nagash, who do you have in a 1v1 fight? Who wins that?
Mazdamundi, hands down.
Hands
Not
down?
even close.
Okay. Not even close?
Mazdamundi was able to shatter the Chaos Moon. Nagash, not so much.
Fair enough. Okay. I thought that Nagash being able to rise the collective dead of literal millennia of war throughout the entire world was a maybe not as impressive as destroying Morslib as it rained down on the Southlands and on Lustria, but it's still pretty insane. And
I will add a small note. If Nagash in the End Times had succeeded in absorbing the Wind of Death, he would have been more powerful. But as anyone who read the End Times...
It was tainted.
It was tainted because of a nasty little trick pulled by the High Elves and a few of the vampires.
And which I guess we'll actually kind of talk about a little bit when we're talking about Finnabar, if I understand that story correct. But
yes,
yeah,
we'll definitely talk about that.
Okay, so there's that to talk about. For the Skaven and Lizardmen, we think there's one very clear DLC that we'll be getting pretty early on, similar to the Grim and the Grave and the King and the Warlord, and this would be the faction of Sotek versus Clan Pestilence. So we don't know yet obviously don't know yet if Clan Pestilence is going to be playable faction upon release, but it is very likely that the Prophet of Sotek, Tenenwan, who is a skink commander effectively, and he is the Prophet of Sotek, and Lord Skrolk, who is the playable Clan Pestilence leader, although Nurglich is actually the Council of 13 representative for Clan Pestilence. We think that a 10-1 versus Skrolk, Lizardmen versus Clan Pestilence DLC would be very likely early on and allow us to flesh out some of those Lizardmen units and maybe give us some regiments of renown as well. So that seems very likely. Skaven in general are going to be super interesting, obviously, because they're in so many different locations in the Old World and in Lustria. They have Clan Pestilence in Lustria. They have the Council of 13 in Skaven Blight. They have Clan Molder in Hellpit up near Norska and up near Kislev. And they have Clan Wars, which could start in Karak 8 Peaks, or they could start in Skaven Blight and race to Karak 8 Peaks like that. So we think, or at least I personally think, that Thankwall, Grayseer Thankwall, and Queequeg Taker are going to be the two starting lords, but it really depends on whether Clan Pestilence starts out as a playable faction. If they're playable at the beginning, very likely that either Nurglich or more likely Skrolk will be the starting legendary lord in Lustria, and then certainly at some point Queequeg Taker and Grayseer Thankwall will become playable in Skaven Blight. But it'll be very interesting to see how CA handles their starting positions and their starting sub-factions, which of course there are a lot of variety to choose from.
Right, and just to give a little bit of lore background for those of you who are curious on that particular subject, going back just a little bit, yes, definitely the Rat and the Serpent is a very classic showdown between the Lizardmen and the Skaven, and has happened multiple times over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years in the Warhammer timeline, ever since the Skaven sort of came into creation. But as far as the Skaven legendary lords are concerned, I think Grayseer Thankwall is definitely a first pick for many people, and likely the faction leader of the Skaven faction, who is a very storied individual. He's probably one of the most hilarious and misfortuned villains to ever grace the Warhammer universe. However, despite that, he has a pretty terrifying success record. He has invaded Nuln, he has invaded Lustria. He even managed to, he killed a potential Prophet of Sotek who was looking to place himself at least as powerful as Tenenwan, if not maybe even more so, but Thankwall's machinations accidentally ended up, of course, undoing him. He even invaded Nuln, but was thwarted there by Gotrek and Felix, as he was their primary antagonist before he wandered his way into being the kind of the face of the Skaven faction for many people. He's a very nefarious Grayseer who snorts warpstone dust and likes to cackle and is very paranoid, but of course is always backed up by his massive bodyguard Bone Ripper, who is a rat ogre who I think he's on the 14th iteration of, because it keeps dying, but Thankwall thinks Bone Ripper is just too good of a name to throw away. It'll be interesting to see which version of Bone Ripper they would go with in that case. Of course, the other Queequeg Taker we already talked about, and Skrolk, could work as either a DLC lord or as a starting character for Clan Pestilence, who are of course the primary clan you would expect to see in Lustria, though of course Thankwall has been there and led a Skaven force there before. There's also the opportunity for Clan Skarier to maybe be featured with Ikit Claw, as they are primarily in Skaven Blight but are known to wander, and I would not be surprised to see him. Of course, my final thought on that would be that they could pull what they did with Gorst, where they might decide to bring Nurglich out of retirement and make him a legendary lord, despite the fact the Councils of 13 members very rarely take to the battlefield. But it would be exciting to see him as a DLC character. But with that, I think we can go ahead and start moving on to the more pointy-eared folks.
Yeah, well, before we make that segue, High Elves and Dark Elves, obviously very seafaring nations. The question is, and you can do this very quickly, how would the Skaven and the Lizardmen fit into that equation in terms of naval combat? Would they even be implemented in terms of naval combat, or do they have their own ways of crossing the oceans?
Right, good question. So the Skaven in particular actually do have fleets. The Skaven were the first race, and kind of the only race, to invent submersibles, so submarines. However, they are not the most reliable of machines.
Welcome to Skaven.
Yes, and tend to have very unfortunate endings, but they are explosive and very dangerous. But yes, the Skaven are known for ramshackle feats. They have invaded Ulthuan twice, both to horrible, horrible failure, though they gave a good effort. The Lizardmen are a little bit more tricky. They, much like the Demons of Chaos, prefer to travel the world through more magical means or more instant means, or in many ways kind of like the Wood Elves too. The Lizardmen kind of cheat by doing one of two things typically. If it's a long-distance transportation, either the Slann will literally just open a portal on the spot and the Lizardmen will march through and appear wherever they need to be, or they will use something called the Paths of the Old Ones, which are basically ancient webways, if you're familiar with 40k, or gateways the Old Ones used to use to hop from one part of the world to the other. The Lizardmen know how to walk across them and end up where they need to go. Of course, if they're feeling lazy or want to take, or as far as the Slann are concerned, or want to take a short jog, the Slann have been known to just create magical rainbow bridges over the water. The Lizardmen just walk to where they need to go.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that answers your question if you're thinking Lizardmen might be a big naval power, considering that they're on a very isolated island. Probably not going to... They're... Honestly... In their implementation in Total War Warhammer, they will probably just get some gigantic turtle or something where you see like a little turtle on the minimap when you move your army into the water. For example, the Beastmen get a narwhal when you're moving their faction across the water. It'll probably be something like that, and then you just see them move across the water like any other navy. If CA wants to be really cool, they can do stuff like the rainbow bridges or the Old Ones portals. I would love to see a portal system in the game. I really wanted to see it with the Wood Elves. I think that a world route system where an army appears halfway across the world, whether that becomes some kind of economy system where you have to pay world route points or something to be able to transport, because it's a very powerful ability, that's something that could be discussed. But I would love to see some kind of portal system added. But Lizardmen, not exactly a naval faring race. So there's that. Let's talk about High Elves and the Dark Elves real quick. So correct me on my lore here if I'm wrong. I'm going to talk about them for a second, and then you can jump in. We're very clear on who we think are going to be the starting legendary lords. So Finnabar is the Phoenix King, and he is technically the faction leader for the Azure, but he very clearly will not be a faction leader. He won't even be playable at any point in the trilogy. I don't think he was never playable in tabletop that I'm aware. Never a huge part of the army books from what I understand. And to top it all off, the dude is a cuck. Literally, he is well aware of the fact that his wife, Alarielle, the Everqueen of the Elves, is having sex with Tyrion, who is the defender of Ulthuan, and we believe that Tyrion and Teclis are going to be the first two legendary lords for the High Elves. They're brothers, and as I've mentioned so many times now, they perfectly fit the duality of melee powerhouse and powerful caster that Creative Assembly logically seems to go after. Additionally, what we were talking about Nagash, how Nagash was poisoned during his ritual and didn't fully absorb the Wind of Death. I think, and I'm not 100% sure on my lore here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but Aliathra was the bastard daughter of Tyrion and of Alarielle, and basically her blood was not pure. It was not from the line of Anarion. It was not pure blood. So when she was sacrificed in that whole end times debacle where Nagash was trying to bind himself to the Wind of Death, she basically didn't purposely, but she knew what it was. She knew that she was a bastard and that her blood would not perfectly form the ritual, and that's why Nagash was not as powerful as Lord Mazdamundi. Is that correct?
Very close. As I'll start with the Aliathra thing of that. She's, of course, the daughter of the Everqueen and Tyrion. That is correct. The reason Nagash was affected was because she actually did have Anarian's blood. And Anarian's blood comes with Anarian's curse, which is why the twins kind of suffer from some small maladies.
Because Tyrion is the blood of Anarion. That's correct?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. The blood she was supposed to have was the blood of Ashurin.
Okay.
Which, of course, would have been passed through the Phoenix Kings.
The creator. He's the main High Elf god that the High Elves believe in, right? Azurian is the creator?
Right. And he's in your Wood Elf tech tree.
Yep. Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah, that being said, to talk about the High Elves in particular, it is very likely we will see the legendary lords of Tyrion and Teclis, the brother heroes of the High Elves. You will probably not see Finnabar. Finnabar is very much a diplomatic individual. He did travel the world, and that's why he was basically made Phoenix King, is he is one of the few High Elves that has seen the entire world. He was one of the few to discover and meet the Wood Elves of Athel Loren. He met with the dwarves after a very long time of the two races not speaking to one another. and saw a lot of interesting things, and the High Elves felt that his worldliness, as far as his humbleness to do these travels, made him appropriate for the Phoenix King in this new age. That being said, he's not particularly well known for being a great fighter or champion or hero. Every time the Dark Elves have invaded, he tends to just hold up in Lothringen and wait for Tyrion to save him.
Pussy.
In his defense about the whole Tyrion thing, High Elves are very fast and loose when it comes to committed relationships, and it is expected when the Phoenix King takes his throne, or the Everqueen takes her throne, that the two of them are supposed to get together and have a baby that usually becomes the new Everqueen. Alariel cheated, and she did not lay with Finnabar, or did not lay with him enough that they had a child, and she dropped the ball on that, and she deceived everyone into thinking it was Finnabar's child when it was in fact Tyrion's. It's not unusual for the Everqueen to have a consort outside the Phoenix King, but her first child is supposed to be the Phoenix King's. So she kind of screwed everybody on that one, but it ended up helping with the whole Nagash thing. So what are you going to do? As far as Tyrion and Teclis themselves are concerned, Tyrion is your very typical Tolkien-esque hero. He is the brave knight in shining armor who is protected by magical wards and wields a blade and rides a massive horse named Malhinder, who is, of course, the descendant of, I can't recall if it's the god of horses or the first of horses. And he is basically just a super amazing duelist who's one of the fastest fighters in the old world and is protected by some serious enchantments. Also, his sword breathes fire, which is nice. Teclis, on the other hand, is his twin brother who, because of an Arian's curse, is very physically weak. He uses potions to sustain himself just to get around and to walk, but he's one of the most powerful casters in the Warhammer universe, outside, of course, of the Slann themselves, and is able to go toe-to-toe and even defeat the likes of Malekith the Witch King, who is thousands of years older than him and should have been a better sorcerer. He is a very, very clever individual and would likely be starting off in Safari, which is the mage realm or kingdom of Ulthuan, while we would see Tyrion in Lothern, which is the capital of Ulthuan, and often the place where Tyrion is found dealing with the courts and being a representative of the Phoenix King.
Alright, and so with all that said, we are now talking about what High Elves are going to be bringing to the table. We can talk about Dark Elves in a second. In terms of a High Elf versus Dark Elf DLC Lord pack, something equivalent to the Rat and the Serpent that we might get with Skaven and Lizardmen, or the Grim and the Grave, or King and the Warlord. We've been talking about a very likely possibility of Alariel the Everqueen if she's not a starting Legendary Lord, because we think Tyrion and Teclis will be the starting two, on Alariel the Everqueen versus Helebron, the head of the Cult of Cain. So do you want to quickly do some backstory for Helebron and why she might be a good DLC character?
Yes, Helebron and Alariel are kind of opposites in that they're both very strong religious figureheads for their various race. Alariel in particular, of course, is the Everqueen of Ulthuan, which means that she is the spiritual leader of Ulthuan and kind of inspires their hope. She resides within the magical realm of Avalorn, which is very similar to Avalorn, just not as many tree people, and much less dangerous. She is a very powerful caster. She's the most anti-demon character that exists within the Warhammer Fantasy universe. She's a character that, with the merest touch, can cause a demon to literally explode into very tiny fragments and just banish them to the realm of chaos. Helebron, on the other hand, is the Hag Queen of the Cult of Cain. She is the leader of Harganeth, which is the executioner city within Nagaroth, and is a city that very much embraces the god of bloody-handed murder. She is very, very crazy, does not like Morathi, who we'll talk about in a little bit, but she is a very emphatic cult leader within Nagaroth and would be a great character to, of course, introduce some of the Cainite units and the very dreaded Cauldron of Blood, which is a Lord mount that is very, very famous for anyone who knows anything about the Dark Elves. Yeah, so the Dark Elves are very interesting. They've got a lot of cool named characters. There are some that are not super well known. Lokir Felhart, the Kraken Lord, would be an example of a hero that I would love to see in the game that could get upgraded to Legendary Lord status. There's, of course, Malice Darkblade, who had an entire omnibus written about him. Huge fan favorite, very powerful and popular Dark Elf character. But again, logically speaking, the starting Legendary Lords are going to be Malekith, the Witch King, and his mother, Morathi, the Hag Sorceress of Grond. So do you want to go into a quick description of Malekith and Morathi? Sure. Malekith is kind of the penultimate hero fallen from grace in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. He is someone he's the son of Anarion, who Anarion the Defender was kind of like the great super savior of the elves that everyone respected and wanted to be. But he basically he held many of the darker sides of Anarion that the elves like to forget about, in that he was very bloodthirsty and dominant and ruled over people with cruelty rather than with just benign helpfulness like they came to expect from Kalidor Dragon Tamer. So Malekith basically went crazy in many senses when he was not given the ability to be the Phoenix King. He was passed over because they were afraid that his warlike nature would taint the throne. This made him very upset, and he basically, with the help of his mother, caused Ulthuan to go into a massive civil war that killed hundreds of thousands, if not more, elves, as brother fought brother, mother fought daughter, so on and so forth. And the island of Ulthuan was sundered in an event, of course, called the Sundering, and many parts of the island sank beneath the waves. Many of the kingdoms never recovered. Malekith, of course, then led his minions across the sea after he lost the Civil War to Nagaroth, where he established a new empire. Malekith is very cruel, but he's one of the more fascinating characters in the universe, as he is an excellent example of someone who is a very powerful caster and a very good fighter. If you think the leader of the Vampire Counts, Manfred von Karstein, is scary and how good he is at casting and fighting, up that a little bit more in the fighting tree, or up it a lot more, I should say, and that's Malekith. He, of course, uses the power of dark magic, which is a very brutal lore that's all about tearing your enemies into tiny, horrible pieces and causing terrible amounts of agonizing pain. He wears very enchanted armor because he's very burnt beneath it and can't live without it, but it protects him from all but the greatest of attacks. And he rides a massive dragon named Seraphon, who is a horrible black dragon who breathes noxious gas that ignores armor, and he is a terror to fight in combat or when it comes to magic. Then, of course, is his mother, Morathi, who is a very old character, though she looks as beautiful as an elf maiden in her early years because of horrible sorcery and using the blood of virgins and all that usual good stuff. Morathi is basically a super powerful caster. That's what she specializes in. She is one of the most nefarious characters in Warhammer literature and is very good at manipulating people into doing what she wants. She has no problem making pacts with demons, the dark gods, or the Norskins, and making everyone do her bidding, and she's kind of one of the ultimate schemers in the Warhammer universe. She's very dangerous upon the battlefield, being no slouch in combat, owning a sleuth of magical items, and of course wielding the lore of dark magic to levels Malekith kind of wishes he could, though he's very close, and allowing her to bombard her foes with horrible amounts of magic, though I would not be surprised to see her gain access to another lore as well. And she, of course, rides her dark Pegasi named Solifet, who is very unpleasant, and has gored many people on his single horn. But those are kind of the lore between the two characters we're expecting. Malekith, of course, from the city of Nagaron, which is the capital of Nagaroth, and Morathi from the Tower of Grond, which is where most sorceresses come from, and is kind of one of the more northern fastnesses that defends against the Norskins and Chaos.
So it'll be pretty hilarious if all this discussion turns to naught, and for some reason they decide to do Tomb Kings and Ogre Kingdoms and Chaos Dwarfs or whatever in Game 2, but regardless, it is going to introduce a lot of you who have never heard of these factions or want some basic knowledge about them. Should hopefully help you out on that front, and I think we did a pretty good job in this one of explaining why these four races are very likely in Game 2 going to be the four major playable ones. Again, some of this was speculation, but in terms of the actual lore knowledge and the unit knowledge and the legendary lord and starting locations, like that's obviously all stuff that we know and have discussed at length before the video started. So hopefully we get all this. Hopefully most of the stuff we said in this in this video is correct in terms of our speculation about when the game comes out. Again, I really don't think it's going to be a long time before they announce Game 2. Need to strike while the iron's hot. Need to make sure that people who are interested in Game 1 are also interested in Game 2 and Game 3. And the longer they wait, the worse it's going to get for them. The more fans are going to drop off and just move on to other things. So I am expecting Game 2 with the Lizardmen, with the Skaven, with the High Elves, and the Dark Elves to be announced sometime in the next 3 or 4 months, I would think, and then be released either in quarter 4 of 2017 or quarter 1 of 2018. We'll see if our speculation comes to pass. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it was useful information. If you didn't, or hopefully it just gave you some new information if you already knew some of it. And Sotek, do you have anything else you want to say to the viewers?
Not really, other than I'm very happy with Game 1, though it could use a little tweaking.
Absolutely.
And I'm very, very excited for Game 2. I'm personally hoping they announce it this month. But I like to cut all the times in half and just pretend everything goes according to my
I will say
schedule.
there's a 0% chance they announce it this month, but I do think that they will announce it sometime within the next 3, 4, maybe 5 months. So we'll see whose speculation comes to pass on that front. Again, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you all in the next video. Have a good one.